Rasha was one of the lucky ones. She had family both inside and outside prison supporting her. She may have disappeared from her friends for a while, but she hadn't dropped off the face of the earth. The family had an attorney, friends, and relatives, and a growing chorus of advocates demanding their release. That wasn't the case with most of the post-September 11th detainees. Hundreds were arbitrarily arrested in the first months after the terrorist attacks. One man, a Palestinian legal permanent resident, was stopped for driving 4 miles over the speed limit in North Carolina. He spent 4 months in jail. Many of the men, and they were overwhelmingly men, were denied access to counsel, secretly shuffled between facilities, and deported in midnight planes back to their home countries, sometimes without having their families in the United States notified, and, in at least one reported case, without even his own clothes. Human rights organizations watched with horror as the situation unfolded and then took action. Around the same time that Rasha was freed, in May 2002, Amnesty International released a report that charged the U.S. government with violating certain basic rights guaranteed under international law. These include the right to humane treatment, as well as rights which are essential to protection from arbitrary detention, such as the right of anyone deprived of their liberty to be informed of the reasons for the detention, to be able to challenge the lawfulness of the detention, to have prompt access to and assistance from a lawyer, and to the presumption of innocence. By 2003, the Office of the Inspector General, OIG, of the Justice Department completed its own investigation and, in a report of more than 200 pages, reiterated many of the concerns held by Amnesty International. The OIG recommended, among other things, that the FBI should adopt more objective criteria in future cases involving mass arrests. Religion and ethnicity, in other words, should not be sufficient grounds for incarceration. The OIG also recommended that future arrests might require some level of evidence linking the alien to the crime or issues in question. A bold proposal indeed. The OIG's reports, a supplementary one came later, also corroborated recurring allegations of abuse, particularly of male detainees at MDC. September 11th detainees, the OIG found, were slammed, bounced, and pressed against the walls of the prison, even though they were compliant. This often happened in the Sally Port that had taped to its wall a bloody t-shirt embossed with a U.S. flag and the words, "These colors don't run." Twisting a detainee's arms behind his back was routine, as was pulling back his thumbs and bending his wrists forward toward his arms, a practice common enough to be known as goosenecking. Guards yanked men by their restraints and purposefully tripped them by stepping on their chains as they walked. Detainees' meetings with their attorneys were videotaped, and the men were routinely and randomly strip-searched in efforts to humiliate and punish them. If this sounds like a milder form of the infamous actions performed by American military forces in Iraq, perhaps the resemblance is not merely coincidental. Sergeant Gary Pittman, a Marine convicted of brutalizing Iraqi prisoners, had been a guard at MDC, and he reportedly advised a fellow Marine that when dealing with Iraqi detainees, you have to establish who is in charge, also telling him that Iraqi prisoners needed to be treated the same way as prisoners in New York. Rasha wouldn't tell me if any physical abuse befell her eldest brother or father, just that they were mostly silent about their experiences after the family was reunited. But by the time they were detained, most of the first wave of people who were arrested had already been deported. We may never know how many were arrested. On November 5, 2001, the Justice Department announced 1,182 arrests, then stopped providing a tally. The Inspector General's report acknowledges 762 people detained on immigration charges between September 11, 2001 and August 6, 2002 as a direct result of the terrorist investigation, including 24 already in prison before September 11th. It also says that of these 762, only 6% had received a final deportation order prior to their arrests. In other words, people were picked up randomly through traffic stops or tips by nervous neighbors and snitches. Usually, petty criminals offered leniency for any information that would push the September 11th investigation forward. Such information is often wildly unreliable, and Rasha suspects a snitch in her case. Prior to September 11th, immigration authorities could hold people for only 24 hours before charging or releasing them. But by September 20th, 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft had charged a rule of 48 hours with an emergency exception for any unspecified, reasonable amount of time. Most people detained didn't fight their deportations, which is not surprising considering the stories coming out of MDC. They should have been deported before the legal limit of 30 days, but they continued to be held long after because the government would not free them before completing an FBI clearance. The FBI cleared only 2.6% of detainees within 3 weeks. Some languished for hundreds of days in prison. The average length of detention for a post-September 11th detainee was 80 days. About the amount of time Rasha spent in Bergen and MDC.